Well, there I am.
Victory, there you are. Woo!
Yeah. I had to
Hey,
switch from my computer to my phone to get this to work.
oh, awesome, awesome, awesome. I'm stoked. I'm stoked. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah. Yes, yes. Good to be here.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Christopher Curry of the University of the Bahamas, historian, public historian, a jack of all legit trades to help us understand the relationship of then to now. Uh,
I've
that
been
journey.
listening, though. I've been listening as you've been adequately handling technology, dispensing with historical truths, and trying to figure out how to get me on.
I've been trying to balance that.
Yeah.
And continuing to I hope that I have been accurate in talking about the Bahamas and talking about your book and talking about your work, and people have been listening to so kindly, 75 people out there so kindly listening to me babble on. Marissa from my Patreon community, hey, so thank you, Chris, for really leaning into this. I do appreciate it. How are things in in Nassau
Well,
today?
it's very good. We had a very rainy morning, but it's now sunny and bright outside. I'm on my last day of midterm break, so I'm back in the classroom tomorrow. I actually have, you mentioned AMMC. I'm at AMMC tomorrow for our board meeting from about 12 until 3 o'clock tomorrow. So I have a busy day tomorrow. But today is a good day. Today is a good day.
Now, would you? I have had a job of explaining what the MMC is and what it does. Would you mind just unpacking that a little bit for us?
Sure, not a problem. So AMMC is a government agency that is principally responsible for the heritage affairs of the Bahamas. It stands for Antiquities, Monuments, Museum Corporation. So it does many things. It manages sites, historic sites, three forts, and three museums current, although we're adding a fourth one hopefully by next month in Grand Bahama, which is one of our northern islands in the archipelago here. We also are a regulatory body for underwater cultural heritage. So if you're looking for a shipwreck in the Bahamas, you have to deal with us. There's two types of licenses that we are mandated to give to clients upon their successful completion of the application. We also generally regulate the built tradition, our heritage, architectural tradition, and we do beyond everything else I've said. We essentially are the principal persons that defend our heritage, our built tradition, our relics, antiquities, um, the things that are valuable to us as a country. That's basically what we do. So it's a lot, but that's what AMMC is all about.
And that's a huge amount, because I don't think that people, when they think about the Bahamas, I think they think about Providence Island, right? I mean, I think that they might know Grand Bahama, but this is, I mean, you're talking about how many islands?
Well, there's at least 18 inhabited islands, and there's thousands of smaller islands. We call them keys, that may not have people on them. Some people buy entire islands and build some kind of structure on it to call as a winter residence or a second home. But generally speaking, 18 inhabited islands. We are the largest Atlantic world archipelago. So when you think about like the Caribbean, most of the islands in the Caribbean are single island states. Think about Jamaica, think about Barbados. You have a case of Trinidad and Tobago, which are two islands combining together to form a single state. But most, and then you have these anomalies. Hispaniola is divided into two countries, the Dominican Republic on the eastern side and Haiti on the western third. And if that isn't confusing or complicated enough, there's Aruba that is shared between the Dutch and the French, I believe. So there's a lot of these small islands, but the Bahamas is unique in that it's a chain of islands stretching from almost South Florida all the way down to Hispaniola and Cuba. And geopolitically, it's the closest territory to the United States in the Caribbean.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the questions a bit.
Yeah.
And Clem Fandango's here. I appreciate that. I mean, there are a lot of members of our community here who I've been talking about with your book for a very long time. I did I did 2 lives from Nassau talking about your book just about the last time you and I talked. There are lots of people excited about it. So I want to go into the questions that they issued first. I mean, I've got plenty of questions, of course, but you and I can always talk. So the first question from our folks is that your book is titled Freedom and Resistance, A Social History of Black Loyalists in the Bahamas, which I bought at the Pompey Museum of Slavery and Emancipation, but I'm sure that Chris can tell you the best place to buy it for you folks. But the question is, that title itself is really powerful. Can you start by telling us, in your view, what does resistance mean in the context of Black Loyalists?
Well, in this case, you have resistance that happens at different levels in different places. Resistance to enslavement starts with Lord Dunmore's November 7th, 1775 proclamation, which allows him to create an Ethiopian regiment, which serves the purpose of weakening or destabilizing his enemy, the Patriot forces, who were mostly enslavers in that territory. And so it allows enslaved persons to escape to the British lines in Virginia. And in accepting the conditions of the proclamation, meaning military service and siding with the British during the war, it essentially provides them with safety and opportunity for freedom. That is a kind of resistance that is running away from enslavement and to find freedom through the British proclamation. Now, Benjamin Coral.
So it's more than marinage, right? I mean, it can't just be running away, that this element of resistance has to be something that can be activated.
Yes. And I want to make the point, as Benjamin Corals, the historian, has said about this, that it wasn't that the enslaved who joined the British forces were doing it because they liked the British, say, better than the Patriot cause. It's that their cause was freedom. And it was for freedom that they chose to align with the British, because they thought the British gave them the best opportunity in that moment to find freedom for themselves. And so that explains the level of resistance. Now, resistance is tenuous, as is freedom. And so, as the war progresses, there are several other British officials who are going to offer similar kind of proclamation. During a wartime moment, the fissures of the war provides these openings for persons to claim freedom and to fight for the British. It's important to note that we are also talking about women and children. It's not just men, it's families. Women perform many different duties during the war, and that's been shared, I'm sure, and lots of people know about that. But it's important that this kind of resistance is tangibly felt throughout the war. But it also is important to note that the journey to freedom and continuous resistance happens when they leave North America at the end of the revolution. From the 4 seaports that we know that Black Loyalists were evacuated from, that would be New York, Charleston, South Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, and St. Augustine in Florida. They arrive in places like Nova Scotia, where many Black Loyalists ended up. And the Book of Negroes, as you know, that's a great film. They're doing a sequel to it, I understand. But in the Bahamas, the Black Loyalists arrived here, much like their counterparts in Nova Scotia, had to fight for freedom a second time. White Loyalists tried to re-enslave them. And so Dunmore, who was the last governor of Virginia, ends up coming to the Bahamas as governor of the Bahamas, ironically. And here he's now facing a situation that he's somewhat helped to create, right? So, but in this instance, the problem is compounded by the fact that white loyalists now are claiming Black loyalists as their enslaved, as part of their household. And that was strategic, because the British government gave additional land in the Bahamas depending on the many dependents that were listed on your household list. So the more people that you could get on your household list, the more land you would get. So they often try to, at least in the first instance, acquire Black loyalists as their dependents, and then ultimately re-enslave them completely. Black Loyalists resisted. They fought. In Abaco, one of our family islands, they actually ran into the woods with bayonets, armed, and ready to fight. In Nassau, they hid in some of the urban spaces of Nassau, or they hid further south along the Blue Hills Ridge that we have in the central part of our island here. Either way, this sort of petite maroonage and then the ability to arm yourself is another level of resistance. And then ultimately, Dunmore creates these Negro courts, as he calls them. And he has them in Nassau, but he has to have a special court in Abaco because of the revolt that I just described. And here, claimants, black claimants, have to come into court after, they had certificates of freedom issued by British officials during the war, and they kept those documents with them. When they came into these Negro courts, Dunmore or other officials, magistrates, often would adjudicate in favor of the white loyalists. Even where black loyalists had legitimate papers, legitimate certificates of freedom, 9 times out of 10, white loyalists received a favorable ruling. Wow. Dunmore's particular court in Abaco, you had 29 claimants who were denied freedom in Dunmore's court. Only 1 out of the 30 received a favorable ruling. So that says a lot about Dunmore. It says a lot about this window that was provided and what it actually did. I will tell you that even after the unfavorable rulings in these courts, black loyalists continued to resist, continued to find ways to gain freedom. But it's telling that you have a society of slaves here in the Bahamas where the racial ideology at play and the desire for the governor, in this case Lord Dunmore, to uphold the social order led to these kind of entrenched rulings that had a decidedly negative effect on the black loyalist quest for freedom in the Bahamas.
One of the points that you raise in your book that I just found to be powerful is that that enslaved people were able to go ahead and form their own concepts of freedom as a part of the broader Enlightenment moment, that they were able to sort of conceive of these concepts of liberty, freedom, and then apply them and carry them with them in these resistance moments. Particularly, you talk about them so interestingly in the courts, that they actually have these they share sort of these deep-seated notions about their own liberty, using those same concepts that maybe in the American Patriot Republican kind of way is a version, but there are other versions, and that enslaved people who gained their freedom develop their own versions of these.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it reminds me of a classic study. C.L.R. James, Trinidadian writer, historian, he wrote about the Haitian Revolution, a book that was published in 1939 called The Black Jacobins. And in it, he talked about how the Haitian rebels, they didn't just uncritically accept the Enlightenment ideas that were espoused in France. They retooled it, reworked it to their own particular cause for freedom in Saint-Domingue. They were fighting a revolution, but it required a toolkit that they could develop on their own terms, but influenced by ideas that were being circulated in the Black Atlantic, as we would call it. And so, we think about the Black Loyalists in the same way, that they also are using ideas, whether spurned from the French Revolution or more likely the American Revolution, ideas about liberty and equality. The significant difference, and this is telling, is that Black Loyalists didn't write too many, documents. There's not much written treatises that they wrote. But what we do have is a kind of praxis, the way that they behaved, the things they did rather than the things they wrote, kind of speak to their ideas about enlightenment and revolution. They were cognizant of the rights that they held through those certificates of freedom. They were cognizant of how their rights were being trampled upon by white loyalists trying to re-enslave them. They were aware of how the courts and particularly Dunmore's Negro Court could be used in sort of an unprecedented way to claim freedom in the Bahamas. So it's, I think, very important that we appreciate that their actions in many ways speak louder than anything that they might have written.
Now, one of the you mentioned that these ideas about liberty and freedom coming from the French Revolution and the American Revolution, but you also posed a really interesting point. I have never been a big believer in the broader influence of the Great Awakening in terms of shaping at least the American Revolution. I just don't see it in 5,000 Baptists in Virginia. I don't see it, but you make a persuasive point. You actually got me taking this seriously, because of what you say about the impact of the Great Awakening on enslaved people that they then take into their freedom. That also gives this other kind of way to shape their understanding of liberty and freedom, and that is distinct. That they can use against enslavers.
Right.
Conceptually.
So, the thing is, these Black Loyalists aren't just, and this is an example of cross-cutting identities, right? That they're military soldiers in a sense, the men and to some extent the women fighting in the war. But they're also, many of them, Black evangelicals, and many of them have their roots in the Silver Bluff Church along the borders of Georgia and South Carolina, right? And so they are part of that first wave of institutional builders who are carrying the ideas of their religious fervor attached to the Great Awakening, the revival spirit that they would have gotten from people like Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, the sort of speakers that we know about famously from that period. But it's the Black evangelicals who are also Black Loyalists arriving in places like the Bahamas, Jamaica, Nova Scotia that are bringing an interesting religious message, a evangelistic message that does in some degree, in some way, have a leveling effect, meaning that under the tents and at nocturnal meetings, they're preaching a message of spiritual equality, all right? And you have enslaved and free meeting and congregating at night under the stars or under the tent at these nocturnal meetings. And that's the impact of it. It's not the direct connection, and I'm not one to say like the Great Awakening had a direct impact on the American Revolution. I'm only pointing out that you can trace these Black evangelicals and their connection to Silver Bluff and other early churches in that area to the Bahamas and to Jamaica and Nova Scotia, where you also have these same Black Loyalists, Black evangelicals preaching and starting churches in those territories.
I gotta say that was yet another thing about your book I found fascinating was the formation of these communities in New York and Savannah and Charleston and St. Augustine that are coming together, people that are coming together from all formerly enslaved people who are free Black people who are coming together from all of these other places, and they form new communities, new intersections, and that is informed so much by the Black evangelical, we call it tradition, Black evangelical sub communities within that, but that these communities are able to have their own powerful dynamic, because in some cases, New York City, they're there for years before evacuation, and it hasn't really been studied very well. It hasn't been to understand and take seriously how these communities are being formed, so that they can then take the connections from all over the colonies that they bring into these cities, that they then interconnect, and then they take them to that diaspora, whether it's to Nova Scotia or to Jamaica or to the Bahamas.
Right. And this is the fascinating thing, as to how these communities get transplanted from British seaports during the American Revolution to communities in the Caribbean and in Nova Scotia. And because, they become unique and distinct communities. If you go to Nova Scotia, for example, there's Shelburne and Birchtown that were settled by Black Loyalists, and you have a communal ethos developing, a sense of being in a wilderness. Some of those Black Loyalists in Nova Scotia end up migrating to Sierra Leone. But people like David George and Moses Wilkinson were some of the preachers who ended up in Nova Scotia and built institutions that still exist in those communities to this day. Those communities are still there on the outskirts of Halifax in Nova Scotia. Likewise, in Jamaica, George Lyle was one of these evangelicals, and he started the Native Baptist Church in Jamaica, and his work is still there. I mean, that is one of the most popular denominations in Jamaica, the Native Baptists. In the Bahamas, they settled, the Black Loyalists largely settled in Nassau, at least, in an area called Delancey Town, which is the west side of the downtown area of our city. In that area, there's at least two churches that can be directly tied to the Black Loyalists. One is called Bethel Baptist, and the other is St. John's Native Baptist. And the founders are these Black Loyalists, Prince Williams, Sambo Scrimon, and Amos Williams. And Bethel Baptist is considered the oldest Baptist church in the Bahamas. It's still there on Meeting Street, and across the street is another one, St. John's Native Baptist, which was also founded by Prince Williams. And then there's the Methodists. Sorry, I didn't get his name right. Joseph Paul. He was a Black Loyalist that left New York for Abaco, and eventually he then migrated a second time to Nassau, and he's attributed in my book with starting the Methodist Church in the Bahamas. So these are important figures because they don't just start buildings and churches, they're also part of a larger community of free Blacks. That community of Delancey Town has a rich history even to this day in the Bahamas, much like Shelburne or Birchtown in Nova Scotia. And so, we have to see the richness of these communities, and they persist to this day, and they represent an important legacy from the American Revolution.
And I think that is one of it's a question that a number of people have had, and sort of is a nice segue, is that you also do all of this great work in public history, and I've been sort of singing the praises, particularly of the museums and of your fantastic living history folks at Fort Charlotte. Is that how important is it to represent that history on the ground today in the Bahamas? How important is it to sort of the Bahamian story, and what are the challenges that you face in actually making sure that gets represented through the heritage framework and the cultural basis that you have there?
Well, let me just say that one of the things that we're fighting against, and this may be true in Nova Scotia as well, in Canada, there's this large sort of hagiographic, very patriotic view, we'll even say, of the white loyalists, and for decades we championed the white loyalists for doing everything you could imagine that was good in the Bahamas. So
the loyalist myth,
it's a loyalist mythology, really, that celebrates the white loyalist accomplishments in the Bahamas, and by doing that, what you've done is you have obfuscated and silenced the Black Loyalist contribution. We didn't even know that there was such a thing as a Black Loyalist really until the last 10 or 15 years. And even then, it was only sort of casually mentioned as a sidebar story. It was not placed as a foregrounding narrative that needed to be inserted into the larger historiography on loyalism in the Bahamas. And so my whole thing is, the challenge that we've faced is in the curriculum and in our larger historical narrative on loyalists, we need to find a way to unsettle that tradition. And so my work does that, but I'm more concerned about how we are able to move that forward than just a book. I mean, my book is as good as it may be. It won't nudge anything forward unless it's embedded in our curriculum. And so that's why this is a project I'm working on, and we're hoping it's coming to completion in the next 2 weeks, is a history text at the senior high school level, which includes many new things, but particularly it does include sections in that text on our Black Loyalists. And so we have to do more at the high school level and in our public history spheres where we interface with visitors to our country to let them know that the Loyalist story is more complicated and needs to be unpacked as a complicated narrative. It's not just about white loyalists coming here and transforming the Bahamas. It's about different heterogeneous groups of people who have different interests who are coming here for different reasons. And yes, there's a degree of exploitation and a degree of coercion on the part of white loyalists trying to re-enslave blacks, also establishing a more rigid racial hierarchy in the Bahamas. And so while we can be happy about buildings and schools and a newspaper and islands being settled, we also have to understand that it's a multifarious story, and we need to make sure that we're not losing sight of the contributions that Black loyalists made in that multifarious story.
When at the Pompey Museum, which again, folks, is a wonderful place. Go there the next time you're in Nassau. There is a great narrative that's there that connects so clearly the Black Loyalist experience to Bahamian independence and to, you know, essentially the moment of finally controlled by the Black majority. Um, can you talk a little bit about sort of how then that story works into the public history assets they have at your disposal, like, you know, like the Pompey Museum or like Fort Charlotte?
Yeah, so Pompey Museum is an interesting place because it was originally Vendu House, built around 1767. This would be pre-Loyalist migration to the Bahamas, pre-American Revolution, and it was actually an auction house. That's where enslaved persons were literally sold into slavery in the Bahamas. Well, what was meant for evil has been turned into something good because it's now a museum that celebrates the resistance to enslavement of a particular enslaved person by the name of Pompey and 43 other persons who resisted to the point where they actually got in a boat, they stole the enslaver's vessel, sailed to Nassau because they thought the governor at the time was an abolitionist, which he wasn't. But they at least thought they had a listening ear with the governor. They were captured just before they got to the shoreline here in New Providence. They were imprisoned. 8 of the persons on the vessel were women, 2 of which were pregnant, and they were beaten against in violation of the Amelioration Act of 1823, which forbid enslaved women who were pregnant from being whipped. All right, so the police who whipped them, and this was done in a workhouse, were punished by a slap on the wrist. They were suspended from duties, but again, only about 2 weeks later were they reinstalled in their positions. And the governor had nothing to do with the persons. Pompey and the other 43 were actually sent back to Exuma with a strong cohort of soldiers in tow to ensure that they went back to work. Resistance continued. They refused to work. They started to carry arms and parade around the plantation. They were ready for a full-out war. More soldiers were brought in. Pompey was captured again. He was whipped publicly, I guess, to send a message. They continued to resist for up to 3 years. And it went from 1828 to about 1832. The long and short of it is they never were moved from the island that they were on, which is the main reason why they started the whole revolt. And the land that they held, which was actually owned by the enslaver John Roll, was eventually passed on to them in an African custom called commonage. So to this day, the descendants of Pompey and the other Roll enslaved persons can claim that land in common.
Wow.
And that's really important because it's a kind of small victory in a way. And so, yeah, that's important. And it's what the museum does. It's a beacon of hope. When people go in the museum, they get the rich story of that revolt, but they also learn about, you know, our African Bahamian history. They learn about the customs of Junkanoo.
Mm-hmm.
They learn a little bit about our church beliefs and some of the other very important cultural aspects of our country. And so the museum is really a testament to a struggle to overcome. And so I encourage people to come to Pompeii Museum. It is, in fact, the oldest building on Bay Street, and it's a beautiful space.
And the most colorful.
Yes, yes, yes. There's a mural
Which is
on the
saying a lot
outside.
for NASA.
Yeah, yeah. Our buildings tend to be a bit colorful, but it is probably the most colorful because of the mural on the western wall of the museum. And the upstairs is being outfitted with a new temporary exhibit. We had an exhibit up there for some time on the Lucayans, but that's come down, and we're looking to put something up there sooner than later. So the ground floor, the bottom floor, is the exhibit, the permanent exhibit to enslavement and freedom. And really, like I said, it champions the spirit of resistance found in people like Pompey and others who fought against slavery in the Bahamas.
And I think that Sarah, in her own words, makes a really good point here, sort of building upon your point, is that when you're talking about resistance, is that you have to be in it for the long haul. And you've got to be prepared to be persistent in that resistance, that it's not a day, it's not a week, it's not a month, it's 3 years is a major thing. And Susanna Dean, Dr. Dean asked you a question about, could you talk about Spanish Wells? I don't know what Spanish Wells mean, but I know her, and I know she always knows what she's talking about.
Yeah, that's very nice. Okay, I'm going to be candid in this point, and thank you for bringing it up. Spanish Wells has a very dubious history. It was settled pre-Loyalist by white settlers. Some believe they were from Bermuda. Certainly, they were there possibly during the proprietary period, but it became an all-white community. And the custom was they would allow blacks to come on the island, but they could only stay during the day. They had to leave the island by sundown.
Sundown Island.
Yes.
Okay.
Spanish Wells, and sundown meaning when the sun set, you had to be off the island if you were a person of color. This racial caste system was so stringent that the small community of only 500 to 900 persons wanted to keep the white race as pure as possible. And so a lot of what we would call inbreeding occurred. Cousins were marrying cousins. There's a small gene pool here now. And so there was several genetic defects that emerged that was even documented by a report. I believe it was around 1902. There was a Dr. Pembrose who came to the Bahamas and did a study of the community. And he cited the high degree of dwarfism and some other things as a result of cousins and other people in the small gene pool marrying each other. This continued well into the 1950s and 60s. And only with majority rule did you start to see slow retreat from this racial practice, this racial discrimination. I went to Spanish Wells around 2016 to speak at the graduation ceremony at the Guy Pinder All-Age School there. And I was fascinated. There were only 12 students that graduated. Half of them were black, half of them were white. So I thought to myself, there's some progress being made. Of the 6 black students, half of them were Haitian descent, and the other half, the 3 remaining, their parents worked as either teachers or persons working in the public healthcare system there. There's a clinic on the island. But what I found intriguing, as we dispersed after the graduation was over, everyone went out for dinner. And I found the 6 white Sigillians, that's what they call white Spanish Wellians, they went to the nice restaurant at the very far end of the island. And the black graduates weren't allowed in that restaurant. So they basically were stuck in the park on the side of the road getting some food from a vendor on the side. So what it shows me is, behind that smooth veneer of, progress in that we now have black people that live and work on the island, the truth is, even in 2016, racial discord is still present in Spanish Wells. And so they will boast that they're not prejudiced and they're not discriminatory and all of that. But if you look very closely, you will see something different. And that is even to this day in 2025. I want to share one thing my dad's family is from that community.
Oh,
The Currys are known to be from Spanish Wells. My dad, his family moved to Nassau in the 1920s and 30s. His father was from Spanish Wells. My dad used to go there every summer to stay with his grandparents and his family, and then he'd come back to Nassau at the end of the summer. I have only been to Spanish Wells myself 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 times in my life. And that time when I went there in 2016 to speak at the graduation, that was the first time I stayed overnight, and the last time I'll add. So it's an interesting community, and it speaks to the presence of racism in the Bahamas still persistent. We have enclaves of all white communities, especially in Abaco, and of course, as I mentioned, Spanish Wells, which is off of the mainland island of Eleuthera.
you know what? One of the things that I probably should have started off with, but we had a particularly blunt start. Is Okay, you're Bahamian.
Yeah.
But you went to school in Canada. How do you end up with Black Loyalists, and how do you end up not just from the academic history of Black Loyalists to the public history of Black Loyalists and of Bahamas more general? Basically, what's the Chris Curry story?
I like that, Ted. So, first of all, my mom is Canadian. And she's been here in the Bahamas since 1966, and she never announced her Canadian citizenship. She's a permanent resident in the Bahamas of Canadian citizenship. So I went to Canada when I was 14 to a boarding school. It was called Great Lakes Christian College, and it's located somewhere between Niagara Falls and Toronto, in that area that people call the Golden Horseshoe. The town was called Beamsville. If you blink, you'd miss it. But I did my final years of high school there, and then I matriculated to Brock University, which is again in St. Catharines near Niagara Falls. If you ever want to know anything about the War of 1812, which some people think is the Second American Revolution, and the Canadians will tell you that was the war they won. Now, if you're an American, you would say, well, that wasn't the war the Canadians won. We didn't win, but we tied. But anyways, it's still one of those disputed wars, the War of 1812, but it's venerated at Brock University. I learned a lot about the War of 1812 while I studied history at Brock. I then did my master's degree in Waterloo, and this is significant. When I did my master's degree in history at Waterloo, I studied under Michael Creighton. Michael Creighton is probably the preeminent scholar of Bahamian history outside of Gail Saunders. And so I got my feet wet in Bahamian history at the graduate level doing my master's degree. But you know, it's odd. Sometimes when you go for one reason to an institution, you discover something else significant. And while I was at Waterloo, I took a single course with a guy named James St. George Walker. And the course was in Black Canadian history. And he happened to write a book on Black Loyalists in Canada. I loved his class. We did a field trip all the way down to Chatham. If some of you may know this, Chatham is sort of like the end point of the Underground Railroad. And so I found his class, I hate to say it like this, I found his class more interesting than any work that I did with Michael Creighton. But, right? But the truth is, it inspired me, and this is in 1995. And he planted a seed in my mind, and I thought to myself, you know what? There's something to be said about Black Loyalists in the Bahamas. So he inspired me. I didn't write a paper for him at all on Black Loyalists. I actually wrote a paper on the Toronto chapter of the UNIA, which was a huge organization. As you know, Marcus Garvey's organization was powerful, and it had chapters from Canada, Toronto, all the way down to Argentina, and in the Caribbean as well. So anyways, my whole point is this, I got interested in Black Loyalists through James St. George Walker. I came back home to the Bahamas and started teaching high school, and eventually was able to transfer to the College of the Bahamas. I never lost my interest, though, in the study of Black Loyalists. And so it was a whole decade that passed between my master's and enrolling at the University of Connecticut now for my PhD in 2006. And so when I went to Connecticut, I said to myself, aha, I've got to finish off the idea that James St. George Walker planted in my mind 10 years earlier. So when I went to Connecticut now, that's when I started really looking earnestly at the topic of the Black Loyalists. And that is how I started the project that eventually became my PhD dissertation and eventually became my book, Freedom and Resistance.
I love how there's an element of Pan-Africanism that kind of then brings you to the Black Loyalists.
Yeah, it was not a direct route, certainly, circuitous as it was. But what I like about it is the the desire to see something birth and the perseverance that went through that. Because I didn't start wanting to do it, and he wasn't even my direct thesis advisor. That was Michael Creighton, and I learned a lot under Michael Creighton as well. What's fascinating, I want to share this last little nugget. I find this really interesting. So when I wrote my book in 2017, about 6 months later, I was looking to see who's reviewed my book. You know, as tradition, most scholarly books get reviewed by various academics. And guess who reviewed my book, Freedom and Resistance? James St. George Walker. I had no communication with him. I still haven't. And if that would be a dream of mine now. And I'm not sure if he's still alive or not, but I would love to reconnect with him. But he wrote a fantastic review of Freedom and Resistance. James St. George Walker did. So there you go.
You know, Vegas Lady had some really nice things to say mostly about you. I can't imagine about me, but about doing this work and about making sure that we're telling stories that haven't been told, sort of recognizing the value in it. That whether it's the Patriot myth or whether it's the Loyalist myth, this really is, as you said, it's about sort of taking these stories that have been obfuscated and that have been silenced and not inventing them, not creating them, that just pulling them out into the light and showing people, in fact, what that broader, more kaleidoscopic and more rich history was that gives us meaning, whether that's meaning for resistance or whether that's meaning for other things. So I really appreciate you saying that, Vegas Lady. That was really kind of you, and it's certainly the kind of work that Chris inspires me to do more of. And you know, I don't want to take a whole lot more of Chris's time, but if you have like sort of you know, two things, right, about what kind of lessons right now, and we can come back to this again, but I mean that your experience with the Black Loyalists in terms of informing our perspective of resistance, in terms of as a toolkit today, if there are lessons there, and then to learn more, where should people go besides going to the Bahamas, where I highly recommend.
So one of the things is, of course, resilience is tied to resistance. The fact that they have to continue to fight for freedom even after they end up in a space that is different from the 13 colonies. They, you know, Prince William is a great example. He comes to the Bahamas as a free man. He has his papers. He has his papers with him, certificate of freedom. But he is mentioned in a runaway ad in the Bahamas Gazette. So it's like he had to fight a second time to achieve what he thought he had already won in the 13 colonies during the American Revolution. He ends up winning, of course, his freedom. We know this once and for all, because he's one of the signatories on the deed to purchase the property in which the Bethel Baptist Church is going to be built. And you could not, of course, be a tester or an administrator or an executioner on any legal document if you were enslaved. That was a privilege that only a free person had. So that happened around 1799. So he's a great example of someone who was resilient enough to persevere through several efforts by white loyalists to re-enslave him. And so resilience is something that really stands out for me. The other thing that stands out for me is this idea that the American Revolution was not bound to the 13 colonies. You know, in the historiography of the American Revolution, we like to think that the conflict was this tightly knit battle. Yes, you know, you had Boston, Lexington, and Concord, New York. You had skirmishes in the South, but generally we think of it as a combat a theater of war that was within the 13 colonies. But the conflicts that occur in the Bahamas during the American Revolution, when the Spanish take over the island, when Ezekiel Hopkins takes it over for a few weeks, when it's reclaimed by Andrew Devoe in 1783 with the help of Black Loyalists as well, it speaks to the fact that the American Revolution was not nation-bound, was not bound to just the 13 colonies. It spilled out into unusual
And so
places and spaces.
its ideas.
Right. And in fact, after the wars ended, the fact that Black Loyalists are still fighting for freedom speaks to how there's an unending sort of nature to this war.
Yeah.
All right? If the war is about, as the Declaration of Independence suggests, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's interesting that the people who Jefferson particularly least expected to be fighting for freedom are in fact the subjects who see the most in fighting for freedom in the Bahamas after the war ends. So I think, there's some interesting messages out there that complicate the American Revolution as we understand it. And I think my book may do that.
It does.
Yes. And I think that, what was the second part to your question?
Well, it's really about, where do people go to learn more? I mean, obviously you can go on the ground in Nassau,
right.
But where should they go to learn more?
So I'm thinking now public history. We want to develop a heritage trail, and it's you can do this on your own as a walking tour. But if you get to Nassau and you're coming off a cruise ship or you happen to be in a hotel, I strongly encourage you to take a walk up into Delancey Town. You can actually walk from Bay Street to Delancey Town. You're talking about, half a mile walk. You go up West Street and you'll see the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, which is a retrofitted plantation house, which is now our National Art Gallery, as I said. You can also turn to the right and see the Cathedral Church, the Catholic Church, that's St. Francis. And then you walk a little further down West Street and you get to T-junction with Meeting Street, and you'll be able to see those two churches that I mentioned. Bethel Baptist, founded in 1791, and St. John's Native Baptist, founded in 1835. They're on the same street, Meeting Street, and they're within walking distance from Bay Street. So I would really encourage people, to look at that space as the southern end of the Underground Railroad, because in coming to the Bahamas, the Saltwater Underground Railroad is manifested in these freedom-seeking Black Loyalists. And so while we talk about Chatham for Canada, I want you to think about Delancey Town, right off of West Bay Street as this saltwater underground final destination. That's where people went for freedom as Black Loyalists.
Now, are there any plans for the AMMC or for you to do more digital media engagement so that people can find you online?
Well, it's so funny you mention that, because last Friday I met with a group who they're church members at St. John's Native Baptist, and the cemetery next to the church building is called Bethlehem Cemetery. And so they're interested, they're celebrating their 200th anniversary as a congregation. So they actually are very much interested in doing some restoration work, both on the cemetery. It needs some work. The wall needs to be repaired. There needs to be some signage. We need to look at developing that heritage trail all along that street, the Meeting Street area. And so they asked me to be a consultant on the project. I happily agreed. And so the work is going to be undertaken. We have some research to do in the archives first before we can really launch the signage campaign. But there is some really, really enthusiastic work along the way to really building out a heritage trail that would feature these Black Loyalist sites that I've spoken about.
And it's so much. One of the things that has been my experience every time I go, whether you go to Pompey Museum, whether you go up to the Art Museum, or you go even over to Watlings, which has its own part of Loyalist history, is that you can experience. It is one of the few places that I've been to in which you can learn about the history while you are embedding yourself in the culture, in the living, active culture of the place, and that's a powerful synergy.
Yeah, Yeah, and the Watlings Distillery, I tell you, really fascinate me how much you know. That used to be Stephen Delancey's home. It used to be called Buena Vista. At one point, it was a restaurant, and now it's been turned into a rum distillery. And they just added a Lee and Steins, I think it's called. It's a coffee brewery franchise. They've added that to the mix, so it's a very nice spot. And it's a really nice old Loyalist built structure
And can
that's
you
been
see Fort
retrofitted.
Charlotte from there?
Fort Charlotte is a stone throw away as you head west on Delancey Street. You can cross Nassau Street and you could be at Fort Charlotte. And if you go to Fort Charlotte, you'll get to see, I think you referenced it earlier when you were talking about the West Indian Regiment
Yeah,
soldiers.
yeah. Please
We do
talk about them.
reenactments. Yeah, we do reenactments there every day. And upon request, I mean, if we have a large group tour, we'll often do the reenactments just for the group. But they're great. And they're trying to expand. I'm no longer the director at AMMC, but they're trying to expand the troop from about 6 to about 20, and then eventually we want to get to 50.
And please talk about the people who are doing this. These were I hesitate referring to them as kids. That's a bit
Yeah,
that's patronizing. These are
they're all
wonderful young
still
these are wonderful
right.
young adults who are doing this. They were so smart, so engaging. I just was blown away by them.
Yeah, so they're all over 18. They've graduated from high school, but it's important to mention that they started their training in high school as part of the Ranger program. Now, in the Bahamas, this would be like akin to your Navy, I suppose. We have a Royal Bahamas Defense Force, and in the high schools, they have a Ranger program to try and recruit people who want to go into the military service. And so if you're in the Ranger program, you learn drilling and military parading and all of the discipline that comes with that from a young age. When you matriculate out of high school, you could join the Defense Force. But these are persons that we targeted. They said, you know what? Instead of joining the Defense Force, join
Oh,
AMMC,
that's interesting.
and you can
I
help.
didn't know that.
Yeah. So they're between the age of 18 and 21. They have a military background, haven't been in the Rangers, but they develop their own parading drills. And the handling of the rifles, they do a lot of that work on their own. The last one I saw was on January 31st. Man, they were doing some very interesting things with their rifles, throwing them and twisting them and spinning them around, and I was just so impressed.
Yeah, that's cool. They really are they're really fantastic, and they're so engaging, and it's all kinds of reasons why going to it's we always talk about in public history, we always talk about the magic of place. And that's something that we tend to lose by practicing public history through digital media, right? But because you've got to be on the ground to really understand how to get an essence of a place that actually even connects with its people, and the way that you're talking about it, that going down Meeting Street and going up to the museum and going down to Fort Charles, that you really do get a sense of the people and a sense of the place, about how vibrant it is, and how there's what is always impresses me is this is how it's how sort of clear and present kind of the Black Loyalist story is, but it I don't want to say it's a celebratory story. That's overstating it, but there's pride in this, right? And there is a sense of legacy there that I think a lot of Americans do find when they encounter it, and would find new, that wait a second, a dimension of the American Revolution that we never hear about, and yet it is almost an alternative history of the revolution in real time there in the Bahamas, living today almost as a product of that, but one that is a product of Black freedom and of Black agency, really, that is even embodied in these young people who are part of the living history unit.
Yeah, I love how you put that. I agree that this is an example of Black agency and the resilient spirit that you see that is transgenerational. That's been passed down to the present. And while there's more that we can be doing in building out the heritage trail and the ultimate experiential tours and stuff that you know that is part of what public history is all about now. We have a great national treasure in that community, in our forts, in the way the reenactors have really taken on the role that they play. It's just a really great product. And we're so happy that visitors are coming now to our shores. People aren't just coming for sun, sand, and sea. When they come to the Bahamas now, they want to see a rich heritage experience, and that's what we're trying to do.
I think that's a great place to end it. I mean, I've taken up a lot of your time, and I really do appreciate it. And I appreciate all of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that Tech threw at us at the
Yeah.
beginning. And we will catch up with each other, but we'll also I hope you're willing to come back and do this again. That we can talk about this a lot more.
Absolutely, and I'm glad we were able to get on and resolve the tech issues that we had at the beginning.
It's through your points of resistance, resilience, and persistence. Actually won the day. So I appreciate that.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you for having me, and certainly we look forward to greater collaboration. And I know I still owe you something. I'll try to get it to you within the next day or two.
Okay. Great.
All right. Take
All right,
care.
cheers. Thanks everybody for coming. We really appreciate it.